It has become normal on the left to demand the abolition of ICE and the 20,000 agents who work there and enforce our immigration laws. Just a few weeks ago, it was only a few activists on the far left who were calling for this. And then this week on Tuesday, congressional candidate Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez won a Democratic primary against Joe Crowley in New York. She ran on abolishing ICE. And now, in a flash, ambitious Democrats are scrambling aboard the bandwagon. Last night, for example, Senator and career opportunist Kirsten Gillibrand of New York said that she favors abolishing ICE, the opposite of her opinion from a few years ago. Kamala Harris of California says she's open to that as well. Bill de Blasio, the mayor of New York, has also called for abolishing ICE. So I have 7 Democrats in the House. This is gathering steam, this idea. And yet no one who's advocating for it seems to be thinking, even for a moment, about what the effect would be if we abolished ICE. For example, as we speak, millions of people want to enter this country. The entire city of Tijuana, Mexico, is already filled with tens of thousands of would-be asylum seekers from all over the world, Central America, Africa, everywhere, as well as many as 500,000 people who've been deported from the United States. The net effect? Tijuana is not a pleasant place to live. What will happen when word gets out that nobody in any country on the globe has anything to fear from our immigration authorities? If you can make it past our border patrol and get a tourist visa, you can overstay and you can never be deported. Once people know that, how many people will move here illegally every year? 1 million? 5 million? 10 million? Who knows? How many of them might be criminals or extremists or future welfare dependents? We don't know that either. We do know it won't be long, if that happens, until dozens of U.S. cities resemble what Tijuana looks like right now. None of these new anti-ICE lawmakers seem to be asking any of these questions. They don't seem to care what the answers might be because they're irrelevant. They know that if we abolish ICE and our borders become irrelevant, they'll get what they want: a new body of voters who can shove aside the troublesome people who are already American citizens. The people demanding the abolition of ICE aren't looking out for those. Ordinary Americans don't want ICE abolished. A new poll from Harvard shows that even 60% of Democrats don't want ICE abolished. It's a radical position, but it's also the new normal on the left. Enrique Acevedo is a Univision anchor, and he joins us today. Enrique, thank you for coming on. So ICE, in addition to the many things that it does, of course, it arrests and deports thousands and thousands of criminal aliens, illegal aliens in the United States who've been convicted of felonies, and it deports them. That is its job. No other agency does that. If we abolish ICE, who will do that?
Well, I think part of the problem is that there's a lot of confusion about what ICE is. And the confusion in part has to do with the fact that many people believe that their job is, as you were describing in your introduction, to try to stop immigrants when they want to come through the border. That's the Border Patrol's job. That's not ICE. ICE's mission has to do with human trafficking. It has to do with trying to prosecute the companies that are hiring and exploiting undocumented immigrants in the United States. And part of the problem is that it has stayed away from that mission and is not only focused on mass deportation.
But again, ICE, and you may not agree with everything that ICE does, but if we abolish ICE, who will arrest the thousands and thousands of convicted felons who are in our country illegally, who will interdict the fentanyl that's flowing across our borders from Mexico? Who will fulfill those roles? Who will protect the country? No one seems to be answering that.
Well, first of all, the vast majority, I would say 80% of those arrested by ICE are people who have no criminal records. They're not rapists or murderers. They're not criminals. They're just undocumented immigrants. They're only.
But I'm not saying they are. I'm just saying that there are a lot of criminals. And what will we do? I understand. I understand. We can debate whether, that should be a crime that we prosecute for. But we do know that there are, as Donald Trump said, and roundly mocked for saying it, there are actually rapists who come in. I'm not saying there are millions of them, but there are some. There are thousands of convicted felons in this country illegally. Without ICE, do we just let them stay? I mean, what is the answer, since the left is calling for the abolition of ICE?
I don't know if there are thousands of them, and I'm sorry about the wind. We're in a high rise here in Mexico City, but I don't know if there are thousands of them. I would say there are some cases, and then we have police officers, we have law enforcement that can take care of that. I don't think ICE has to be worried about that. like I was saying, it has to be worried about human trafficking organizations, about companies that are employing and exploiting undocumented workers, that are attracting a lot of undocumented immigrants into the U.S., and not focusing solely on separating families and on mass deportation.
So, in other words,
right now.
In other words, you don't care really what happens to those criminals within our borders. I mean, that's of course the answer. Let me ask you a more basic question: should someone who overstays his visa in the United States be deported?
I think we can use our resources much better, much better.
Okay. So if you overstay your visa, you get a tourist visa, come to the United States, and this happens, hundreds of thousands of times annually, and you ignore the length of your visa, you're here illegally, should you be deported?
Well, of course, I think if you are in the country without documents right now, you should have to follow the right process. And the process right now calls for deportation. This is the thing. There are millions of people in that situation. Who do we deport first? How do we start? Do we deport families that have been here for 15, 20 years, obeying the laws? Or should we start by people who have committed a crime? That should be the focus.
But maybe hold on. But maybe without ICE, we're not going to be. Hold on. Without ICE, we're not going to be deporting people who've committed crimes. So I'm asking on the other end, can we even deport people who've overstayed their visas? Let me ask you this: if illegal immigration makes a country so much better,
you have to make a choice.
If importing poor people from the third world,
who do you deport first?
Okay, we actually don't have very. No, we can afford this. But I want to ask you though, if importing a lot of poor people from Central America makes your country better, why hasn't it made Tijuana better to have thousands of Central Americans there?
When was the last time you went to Tijuana, Tucker? Because I'm happy to go with you. We can go next week. They have incredible restaurants. The city is, much better than it was a couple of decades ago. It's
I grew up next to Tijuana. I've been there a lot. I've been there a lot.
Incredible establishment. So let's go to Tijuana so you can see it's not the horrible place you just described.
Look, what I'm not saying it's a horrible place. What I'm saying is that there are hundreds of thousands of people in Tijuana in legal limbo. Mexico doesn't want to let them stay. And my question is, why not? If having undocumented immigrants, as you described them, in your country makes your country better, then why doesn't Mexico give them all Mexican citizenship tomorrow and let them vote in the upcoming presidential election? Real question.
Well, a couple of things. First of all, since Donald Trump became president, Mexico has deported over 200,000 immigrants to Central America. 200,000. That's 200,000 immigrants that could be at the U.S. border today. So Mexico is doing something to stop undocumented immigration from flowing to the U.S. Those who decide not to stay in Mexico don't stay not because the Mexican government is asking them to leave. They're deciding to go to the U.S. They don't want to stay in Mexico because they're fleeing violence. And like we discussed before, Mexico is not exactly a safe haven when you want to flee violence.
Well, no, but wait a second. There were 1,800 murders in Tijuana last year. 1,800 murders. If, again, having hundreds of thousands of illegal immigrants from Central America in your city makes it better, then why did you have 1,800 murders last year? I mean,
Tucker,
you know the point I'm making, which
cities
is
in the U.S. that have a higher murder rate than Tijuana.
No, actually, you can't. That's not true. You cannot name 10 cities in America with a high. Name them. There aren't 10 cities with a higher murder rate, so I'm not going to embarrass you.
Gun-related violence in this country, right?
Look, let me just say this. Do you really believe
33,000 people die each year because of gun-related violence in this country? That's a fact, isn't it?
The majority of those are suicides.
So the U.S. is also a very violent country. And there are also many cities that have violent crime, like Chicago, like Detroit.
Okay.
None of them are in the border, by the way.
There's no reason to flack for Mexico. There's no reason to be a PR agent for the country of Mexico here. You don't need to defend Mexico. I'm just asking you a question as someone who understands Mexico.
No, of course not.
You know as well as I that when you have an influx of poor people with low education levels and no jobs, it does not make you richer. It makes you poorer. So why are you pretending that the United States benefits from taking in millions of poor people with low education levels?
I can think of many examples of immigrant families that came to the U.S. with nothing and then became dynasties. The Kennedys, for example, from Ireland, which I think is also the country of your family's background. So, that's just one example. The Rockefellers, many of them came to the U.S. without a penny in their pocket, and they became dynasties.
Yeah, I'm actually not Irish, but that's not the point.
So that's not exactly.
Okay. Okay, so
no, but you were saying that
true,
when they come into the country,
What I'm saying is they're very impressive immigrants. I would never deny that. I know a lot of them, and they're great people, and I'm glad they're here. But when you import millions of poor people into your country gets poorer.
Think so from
Let's be honest. Let's stop lying about it. Yeah, okay. No, this is a reality-based show.
No, it's good for the economy. Immigration is good for the economy, Tucker. And it's, widely proven.
It's been great for Tijuana. Yeah. That's why you're kicking them out. Great to see you. Thanks very much. So what exactly would happen if we abolished ICE, as many Democrats, as of tonight, are now calling for us to do? Jessica Vaughan studies this question full-time. She's director of policy studies at the Center for Immigration Studies, and she joins us now. Jessica, very simple question. We're moving toward, the national conversation is moving toward a consensus on the left that we ought to abolish ICE. If we did, what would happen?
Well, the effect is that there would be no rules or limits on immigration. It would be de facto open borders. And that is, I think, what some of the people on the left want. At least they're honest enough to admit it, that they want there to be open borders. Some of them couch it in other terms by saying, no, it needs to be done by other agencies because it's the leadership of ICE, which is complete nonsense. What they're against is immigration enforcement and rules, and they want to delegitimize immigration enforcement. But immigration laws are not some obsolete law in the books that don't deserve to be enforced. Americans want immigration laws enforced because they protect job opportunities for Americans. They protect taxpayers from having to shell out money for people who shouldn't be here, for social services, schools, health care. And they, as you pointed out, keep our communities safe by removing criminal aliens from our country. So it's absurd to say that we should not have this work done. ICE is an important law enforcement agency. What really needs to happen is for ICE to have more resources and the ability to communicate more effectively and cooperate with local police, sheriffs, and other law enforcement agencies so that they can get their legitimate mission done and do it more effectively and efficiently because it benefits our country. It's not fair to legal immigrants not to have immigration laws enforced.
No, and it's not fair to any of us. But now that one party has taken a very clear stand against the idea of borders for a borderless world, at least a borderless United States, what effect does that have on our immigration levels? So the rest of the world has the internet, too. They know that this conversation is going on. Democrats may win this November. Isn't this a draw, an incentive for people to try and come here illegally?
I think it is. I think that we've seen that in other cases when there's been talk of amnesty. We get more illegal immigration because, the people overseas are getting the message that we don't care about enforcing our immigration laws. We see the same effect from sanctuary policies that attract people, and the smugglers certainly use it as a marketing gimmick for them to get more customers. To continue this gives all illegal immigrants a sense of entitlement as well. When people come here illegally, they know they're here illegally, and they expect some consequences. So if they get arrested, they expect to be deported. But when they hear all this talk about abolishing ICE, it creates this sense of victimization for them, and that theirs is a noble cause to be here illegally. And it just undermines the rule of law and our immigration system. And, Americans don't. And
it guarantees you're getting a worse class of immigrant. You really want to import people who started out by breaking our laws? It's like exactly who you don't want. It's nutty.
Right.
Jessica, thank you. Great to see you.
Thank you.
Well, in Washington yesterday, anti-ICE protesters swarmed the city and made their vision for America pretty explicit. Listen to what they said. F your borders, F your walls, we will make your system fall. That's what they're saying. Chris Hahn is a radio host and former aide to Senator Chuck Schumer of New York, and he joins us tonight. Chris, are you comfortable with the direction your party is moving?
I think that there's been a reaction to the gleeful cruelty being administered at the border by this administration, putting toddlers in courtrooms and separating them from their parents. And I think you're seeing a bit of that of a reaction.
You stole that line from Jon Stewart, if I can say. But hold on. Okay, no, I know it's all Trump's fault.
Absolutely.
But hold on. Just as a Democrat, let's just take Trump out. No, I'm being sincere. So last week, you didn't hear any Democrats, mainstream Democrats, say abolish the law enforcement agency in charge of enforcing our immigration law. Now you're seeing a whole bunch of elected Democrats calling for abolishing ICE. Are you comfortable with that position?
Look, I think it's rhetoric. It's very similar to the rhetoric people like Ted Cruz used in 2016 when they said, let's abolish the IRS. Well, somebody's got to collect the taxes. Somebody's going to have to enforce our border laws in this country. So if you abolish ICE, that's just a rhetorical thing being used by protesters right now. Obviously, there are issues that many people in this country have.
It's not just no, but that's not fair. No, that's last week you're talking about. When protesters, when the lunatics, all the Trustafarians, all the angry rich kids were calling for abolishing ICE. Now you have the presumptive Congress. It's true. But now you have mainstream people. You've got a whole list of elected Democrats, including the star of your party, calling for this.
Well, there were 16.
Kirsten Gillibrand, the senator from New York, is calling for this.
There were 16
why is that
Republican
not reckless and crazy?
Candidates, and many Republican presidential candidates call for the abolishment of the IRS. I mean, that's rhetoric. It's political rhetoric. It happens all the time when you have a hot issue.
Okay,
and when there is a branch of the government that's not performing well, as ICE is not. They're not performing well.
Okay, but not performing well and eliminating something are very different. So let me ask you this.
Yes.
If you're a Democrat and you care about the environment, right? You care deeply about the environment. Right. And by the way, I'm with you on that. How is it good for the environment of this country to import millions of poor people from the third world? Is that good for the environment of America, honestly?
Immigration
please answer my question, because it's a real question.
Immigration has always been good for this country. Always been good. Obviously, there's some
Is there any downside at all?
Point to of individuals. No, there isn't.
Is there any downside to letting? So what would be the limit then? If there's no downside, if it's all good, and you know you're lying when you say that because nothing is all good in this life, but let's just, for the sake of argument, pretend you're right. What's the limit then? If it's all good, then why wouldn't you? Then why wouldn't you let in 100 million new people from the third world? They want to come here. Should we do that?
I think when you have a system that's not recognizing the crisis that we're seeing in Central America, where people are coming here seeking asylum, like my family did during World War II, or prior to World War II.
Oh, spare me.
We need to recognize.
No, spare me. It's not World War II. It's 70 years old. But hold on.
There
Can you
are
just answer a single question straightforwardly?
In their beds in Central America, and people are fleeing with the shirt on their back for a better life for their kids.
But I'm an American. Okay, that's great. I'm an American citizen. I feel for anybody who wants to come here. I feel for the suffering of the world, and I mean that sincerely. But I also feel for my children and yours and American citizens. And I think the rest of us have a right to know what the limit is. So if immigration is all good and there's no downside, and you know that's untrue, but we'll just pretend that it is true. Honestly, what's the limit? How many can we absorb and still have a functioning, affluent country? Have you thought about that at all?
Well, Tucker,
or is this a totally faith-based proposition?
Tucker, that is why we need a broad-based immigration reform where Democrats and Republicans and the president
you have no idea,
come to the table, but they need to come to the table and they need to solve this problem right now. They should
but hold on, wait, I'm confused, Chris. Wait, stop. Wait, why is it a problem? You just told me there's no real downside, and then 30 seconds later you describe immigration as a problem.
No. The problem is the
enforcing
system
our
that
laws
is
is the
not
problem.
recognizing what's drawing people here, including jobs and jobs being filled. And ICE should be enforcing, as your first guest said, enforcing the laws in the book so people are not hiring and exploiting this labor.
You're totally against E-Verify. There's not, I don't think I've spoken to a liberal who's honest on this question in the last year, and it's really telling.
I think I have been incredibly honest, and that's.
Then tell me the number. How many do we absorb and still remain America? Any idea?
Congress needs to set the number. Congress needs to set the number reasonably.
How about none? Chris, great to see you. None. Yesterday's mass shooting in Annapolis seems to have been the work of a deranged man with a long-term vendetta against the newspaper. But pundits and other channels were eager to blame it on political figures they don't like. amazing. Dan Bongino joins us next to discuss that. Stay tuned. Well, an awful shooting occurred yesterday, as you saw in Annapolis, Maryland. 5 employees of Capital Gazette Communications were murdered. Apparently, they were victims of a deranged man who'd had a years-long vendetta and well-documented vendetta against the paper. We found that out a couple of hours
the White House
after
for what
the
happened
shooting yesterday. And yet some people didn't wait that long to blame the White House for what happened yesterday. You saw it again and again. Media figures jumping up and pointing fingers at President Trump, who, for the record, was not in Annapolis yesterday. Breakfast Media White House correspondent Andrew Feinberg was even more direct. He tweeted this: "You caused this, Mr. President." He didn't explain how. Dan Bongino is a former Secret Service agent and NRA TV contributor, and he joins us tonight. It's a little weird, Dan. I kept thinking, and this is not a defense of the president or his rhetoric or anything like that, but it's a defensive accuracy in the truth. These are reporters, journalists, and of all people, shouldn't they be waiting for the facts before rendering judgment? And yet they were the quickest to jump in with ill-informed claims.
Yeah. Tucker, I've never seen anything like this. We are in the most hostile political environment I've seen in my, 40-plus years on the planet where I've been conscious. Listen, Tucker, the horrible shooter that shot up the baseball field in Alexandria, that wasn't Bernie Sanders' fault, okay? Although he was a Sanders supporter, obviously. The Sarah Palin incident with the bullseyes over the target with the Loeffner Street, that was not Sarah Palin's fault, okay? Speech is not violence. And the effort by some, sadly, on the other side of the aisle, to constantly make that conflation when it comes to conservatives, that we are somehow responsible, that Donald Trump is responsible, is nothing but trying to get a heckler's veto over our speech. Donald Trump is perfectly entitled, Tucker, to be adversarial and even at times confrontational with the press if he feels he's being mistreated. How he chooses to deal with that rhetorically is up to him. But the effort to conflate that with violence is utterly absurd and is nothing more than an effort to get a heckler's veto over our speech.
Well, especially since this Ramos guy didn't seem particularly political. He was mad at the newspaper because they wrote a piece about him stalking some former high school classmate. But it had nothing to do with American politics, and the morons immediately start ascribing different motives. Bizarre. Another thing. So another mass shooting question. We got footage from the Mandalay Bay shooting, which took place, as you remember, at the beginning of October, just the other day. And in it, we see the police, or several police officers armed, basically waiting outside the room while the shooting takes place. We didn't get this for more than 8 months, this video. And many people have been asking for it. Is there a possible, as a former law enforcement officer, is there any possible justification for withholding this from the public?
No. And, I've done a lot of commentary on this show about this Las Vegas shooting. I think what's going on here, Tucker, is you have a tourism-heavy industry in Las Vegas that's eager to make this story go away. But, I sincerely do appreciate you staying on this, though, because we're entitled to answers about one of the largest mass murders in American history. And remember, too, regarding that, we don't know what commands were given or why they were given. So it's tough for us, obviously, to second guess anything. But post-Columbine, these active shooter scenarios, obviously the training is to stop that problem right away. Why this was kept from the public, I don't know. But I know there's a lot of moneyed interests that really just want this story to disappear. But we shouldn't. We deserve answers on it.
We're almost out of time, and I don't want to ask you to speculate, but in the broadest possible terms, do you think there are still big things that we don't know about the Las Vegas shooting?
I do. I believe it's related to the motive, and I believe the motive is might be a story that would put that on the front page of papers, and they don't want that. There are obviously people who want the story to go away, and it's not some X-Files conspiracy theory. It's just the fact that it's bad for business, and they'd like to see the story disappear as soon as possible.
Everything comes out in the end, thank God. Dan Bongino, thank you for that.
Sure does.
Well, the president, as you know, has a vacancy now to fill in the Supreme Court since Justice Kennedy has announced his retirement. Who are the frontrunners for that? Who would be the best choice? We'll discuss with perhaps the best informed Supreme Court picker in Washington, D.C. Leonard Leo joins us next. One of the biggest moments of this current presidency occurred this week with Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy announcing that he is retiring from the court. For many conservatives, Supreme Court nominations were the single most important issue of the last election, the reason they voted, and they'll be watching this very closely. Who are the front runners to replace Justice Kennedy, and what do we know about them? Joining us now is someone who knows the answers. Leonard Leo is an outside advisor to the president on judicial nominations, and he joins us now. Leonard, thank you very much for coming on. So we're hearing a number of names batted around. Amy Barrett is at the top of every list I've read in the last 2 days. Tell me, what do we know about Amy Barrett?
Amy Barrett's a judge on the 7th Circuit out there in the Midwest in Chicago. She's from Indiana, very distinguished law professor from Notre Dame Law School, clerk for Antonin Scalia, one of the most articulate and intelligent originalists in the country, very talented woman.
Brett Kavanaugh.
Brett Kavanaugh is a very respected judge here in Washington, D.C. on the U.S. Court of Appeals. He's been on that court for over a decade. He's respected on all sides of the political spectrum as one of the best lawyers in the country. Spent a lot of time in Washington serving in government, arguing before the Supreme Court. He's written a lot of opinions. Very deep believer in the idea that if you want to protect freedom and human dignity, you have to preserve the structural limits on government power in our Constitution. A lot like Neil Gorsuch, Tucker.
So if you're following this at home, who else should you be looking up on Wikipedia right now?
Well, look, the president came up with this great idea, one of the most transparent things we've ever seen in judicial selection, which is to put out a list of all the people from which he'd pick. There are 25 on there, which is an awful lot of people. But you should be certainly looking at people like Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Barrett, Tom Hardiman, who's someone who the president interviewed last time. He's a judge out in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Ray Kethledge, who's a judge out in Michigan. There are a couple of other very distinguished women on the list. Joan Larson, who's out from Michigan, and Allison Ide, who's from Colorado. All Court of Appeals judges, all people who really want to interpret the law as it's written and who understand that the court has a duty to enforce the limits on government power and to interpret the Constitution according to its text and original meaning. They really believe in the rule of law, and it's a tremendous opportunity for the president to pick another justice like Neil Gorsuch, who's extraordinarily well qualified, very courageous and independent, and who wants to interpret the Constitution the way the framers meant it to be.
Can Democrats stop this? Can you imagine a scenario where they could?
I think if the president has a process like he had the first time, engages in lots of advice and consent, picks a great nominee like Neil Gorsuch, if he uses the Gorsuch model, I think it's impossible for the Democrats to really stop him.
Can you imagine? I think Gorsuch got a couple Democratic votes. Can you imagine that happening this time? Or have things changed too much?
I think so, Tucker. I mean, again, if you pick someone who's extraordinary and someone who really does just believe in interpreting the law as it's written, that's what garners widespread public support. And I think it's particularly hard in an election year like this one for moderate Democrats to resist a nominee who's so talented and who's so committed to being a fair arbiter in court.
I think you're probably right. Leonard Leo, thank you very much for that. I know you're right at the center of this process, so it's nice to talk to you.
Good to talk to you, Tucker. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, a year ago, BuzzFeed released the Steele dossier. They said at the time it was totally unverified, and they were absolutely right. A lot of it was false. So now they're getting sued for libel. We'll talk to the man who is suing them next. Going on for quite some time now, and so far it hasn't proved any of the allegations that gave birth to it in the first place. But if you'll remember back to the beginning, all of this was justified in part by the publication of a dossier, a totally unverified dossier, filled with salacious allegations about Donald Trump and many others in his orbit. One person who was targeted was a man named Alex Gubarev and his company XBT Holdings. The dossier claims that XBT assisted in the hacking of the Democratic Party leadership. Now, Gubarev, who denies this, is suing BuzzFeed for libel for releasing the dossier with his name in it. Alex Gubarev and his attorney, Val Gervitz, join us tonight. Thank you both for coming on. Thank you. Alex, you're denying, of course, that you played any role in the hacking of the Democratic Party. Tell me how the inclusion of your name in this dossier has affected your life and your business?
Imagine that in one day, you moved 16 years ago out of Russia. You start your business in European Union and United States. And you work so hard to build a company from scratch. And you have hundreds of employees who work over you, their families depends on you. And one day you just wake up and see that somebody is ruining your reputation and try to destroy your business by telling the criminal that you did something against democracy in the United States. And imagine that, like, you have to explain to your grandmother that you're not criminal because she see news about you on the television. You have to explain, I know that you have a daughter, so you have to explain to your 17 years old daughter that you are not the criminal because she sees this in the news. This affects me on multiple layers. You cannot imagine. Yeah, I still have this pressure every day, and I fight with it on every level.
So, did you do anything that was alleged in the dossier? Did you have any role in stealing information from the Democratic National Committee servers? Do you work for Russian intelligence? Have you taken orders from Vladimir Putin to destroy our democracy?
Of course not. I did nothing.
Why do you think your name was in this dossier?
It's a good question, and honestly, I don't know. And I hope that all court cases which I'm doing now against BuzzFeed and against Christopher Steele in the United Kingdom will help me to find out the answer on this question.
Mr. Gurvitz, have you received any call from the special prosecutor's office summoning you and your client in for a conversation with the Mueller team?
We have not. And in fact, at the beginning of this lawsuit, Mr. Gubarev made it clear that he's willing to cooperate with any law enforcement agency. Notably, no one has contacted us, which tells us that at least the law enforcement agency does not take the allegations against Alex seriously. But he...
wait, frankly, no one. Just to be clear, no one has contacted. We've had a couple different Russia investigations going on for more than a year. Your client's name is in the dossier that forms the basis of these allegations, and nobody has called you. Nobody has called you.
No one. Not a single person has called. And this is the only person in this entire sordid story that has gone on record to be willing to speak to anyone under oath and has given testimony under oath, unlike pretty much everyone else that has been dodging depositions. We just completed Christopher Steele's deposition in London last week. He ran out of appeals, but he certainly fought hard not to give one. Fusion GPS is still fighting us. I think they'll be unsuccessful and they will have to give evidence, but they are certainly trying hard to avoid giving evidence.
And so very quickly, we're almost out of time, but did you get to the bottom of how your client's name wound up in the Steele dossier? Do you have any idea?
We do not. We still have not found a single iota of reason for him to be there, but we're digging. We're continuing to look, and we hope that at the end of the day we will find out.
And yet this dossier has turned our country upside down. Okay. That's very interesting and helpful to hear your side of it. Thank you both for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Oh, it's that time. Time for final exam question. Can you beat our experts at remembering this week's strange and obscure news? There was a lot of it, and you will find out